Good morning and welcome to the East San Joaquin Coalition Winter Outreach Meeting. Appreciate you all taking the time out this morning to come to this event. I'm Perry Clausen, Executive Director of the East San Joaquin Water Coalition. And today I want to spend a few minutes giving you an overview of the coalition and the activities that we're involved with. Some of you haven't been to these meetings before, so I want to just kind of explain the activities that are going on. We've got this new WDR, that's our new acronym to start remembering waste discharge requirements, that we're going to tell you about some of the requirements that are involved in that, and specifically the nitrogen management plan that many or all of you have gotten in the mail. And then I've got a certified crop advisor, Bill Jones, that's going to be talking to you a little bit about what CCAs are. There's going to be a requirement starting next year, and that's something I'll just start out the meeting with. That's requirement for a CCA sign-off got delayed for 1 year. So in our order initially, it was going to be required as of Monday to have a CCA sign-off on your plan. That is now delayed for 1 year. So we've got a little bit of breathing room here. But anyway, we wanted to give you all an idea of what a CCA is and what they do in their profession. And then we've got a gentleman from the Center for Irrigation Technology coming to speak today about irrigation and groundwater protection. Fortunately, it's not a requirement in this order, and hopefully never, that we have to report our irrigation applications. That would be obviously an undertaking unparalleled in agriculture. However, whenever you talk about nitrogen fertilizers, you gotta talk about irrigation, because you can do the best job that you want in fertilizing, and if you over-irrigate, that can cause problems. So we've got a speaker to talk about some of the important things on irrigation. And then Mike Johnson will be here. He's our technical advisor for the coalition. He's going to give you an update on the surface water monitoring that we've been performing on your behalf in the coalition region, and then also talk about these groundwater vulnerability designations. All of you, when you got this nitrogen management plan, had a little box on the side that said whether or not your field was high or low vulnerability. And that was developed through a pretty comprehensive effort by a hydrogeologist firm to determine where the soils were vulnerable to groundwater contamination. So Mike's going to talk about that and give you some background on that. Here's a map of the Central Valley coalitions that are now in place. When the waste discharge requirements were adopted 2 years ago for us, and then subsequently in the southern San Joaquin Valley, the grower groups that were representing farmers like the East San Joaquin decided to split up into more coalitions. So we went into this program 3 years ago with 7 coalitions. Now there are 14 water quality coalitions representing growers. From Fresno North, none of the designations have changed, but from Fresno South, instead of 1, there are now 7 water quality coalitions. And each one of them is doing what East San Joaquin Coalition does. We're representing growers to the Regional Water Board, and we're implementing these requirements that all the farmers have to do. So don't feel alone with this farm evaluation many have filled out, or all of you filled out, in the nitrogen management plan. In not too distant future, all 7 million acres of irrigated cropland that you see highlighted here is going to be doing what we're talking about. Our order was adopted in 2012, so we're a little bit ahead of everybody else. So even your neighbors across the river may not have things to do that you are already doing on behalf of the East San Joaquin, but their time will come. They're starting a year late, it's in particular on the west side, and then the Delta Coalition. So just to give a little background, I mean, I still get questions from growers and members saying, who thought this thing up, and how come they have the authority to do what they're requiring in this waste discharge requirements? Well, the authorities that these agencies have starts at US EPA, and it was actually implemented back when the Clean Water Act was adopted by the US EPA, and it focused initially on the city discharges from wastewater plants, from factories, manufacturing that had surface water discharges. That law was focused primarily on those industries. Agriculture, after the adoption, was given waivers of these requirements. So we had waivers of waste discharge requirements until about the year 2000, and then all the requirements were changed based on some legislation that was passed that ended the waivers and then initiated this irrigated lands program. So that on the state level, the authorities for the regional water boards and the state water boards comes from what's called the Porter Cologne Water Quality Control Act. That was passed not too long after Clean Water Act, and again, it was a state program implementing the federal regulations. So what these waste discharge requirements had in place were, as I mentioned, for all the water treatment plants initially, and then soon after that, factories, anything that had discharges to surface water had to have regulations, had to meet standards that were in place, were put in place by first the Clean Water Act, then Port Cologne Water Quality Control Act. So the program that we had from 2003 to 2013 was called a conditional waiver. The conditions of the waiver were essentially like a waste discharge requirement permit. So you remember, and we are still doing this stream sampling and such. That was under the conditional waiver, but now that has changed to actual waste discharge requirements. So we have a group permit, a group waste discharge requirement that is covering you, so to speak, in this regulatory arena. Now, we are able to do this group approach. The dairy industry was not able to do that. They do have a coalition for some well monitoring, but every grower, every dairyman has an individual waste discharge permit. And if you want to know what it's like to have an individual program, talk to a dairyman sometime. They cost them between $15,000 to $30,000 a year just for the paperwork and the requirements for an individual permit. So what we have done by having a group permit has made it more efficient and a lot more easy for growers to comply. Even though this stuff that you're getting now may seem like a real pain, it's nothing in comparison to the dairy situation. So there is an effort going on to try to change some of the requirements and the numbers that are in the Basin Plan. The Basin Plan is kind of our constitution for the Clean Water Act and the Port Cologne. And we've been working on it for 3 years. We've got another 3 years to try to change the salt standards. It's an incredibly difficult thing to try to change any of these regulations. It's possible, but it's very difficult. And so I often get asked, well, where'd this 10 milligrams per liter for nitrate come from? Can't we change that? Well, we in the CV salts process said we're not even going to touch that, because if we reopen that, there's a very good possibility the number could go down rather than going up because of the concerns about nitrates in surface water and in groundwater. So the Regional Water Board now has the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program with these waste discharge requirements, and unlike it was when it started, it encompasses both surface and groundwater. The term that's used for waters that we are using surface and groundwater is waters of the state. You all are hearing that now with this groundwater pumping and such. The waters are owned by the state. We have usury rights to those waters to irrigate, so they have the authority to put regulations on that. What our regulation is covering, though, is water quality only. We're not in the supply business. Again, back to this groundwater sustainability. That's all about water supply primarily. This only deals with water quality, so we're not weighing into that. The way the regulation is set up is that everybody that irrigates and everybody that's commercial has to have coverage either through a group permit or through an individual permit. It's a statutory requirement throughout the state of California that if you irrigate in your commercial, you need to have coverage for your potential discharges of waste into waters of the state. So that's the long way of saying that anytime fertilizers, pesticide, or sediment goes in the water, they have standards that have been set by these entities. So the requirements are you can either join the coalition, obviously, that you all have done. You can get an individual general order or an individual WDR. And I might add, the only commodity-based WDR is for rice. They are the only commodity that's really very unique in its farming practices. They were able to get their own individual waste discharge requirement. But in the other parts of the valley, it's all crops are covered by these group WDRs. So the East San Joaquin Coalition, here's the stats of the membership now. We have about 720,000 acres. There's approximately 1 million acres of irrigated cropland in these in our 5-county region. There's about 180,000, 160,000 acres under the dairy program. So a dairyman, if he has a milking facility and then he has cropland, he can put his acres under his own individual WDR. So that's where the balance of the acres are. There are still 30,000, 40,000 acres around there that are uncovered. Guys are, I don't know, hiding behind not sure what, but it's not going to happen, or they're not going to be able to do that for much longer. So again, we manage a group permit for our members. This is a group effort that we have undertaken here. So our board of directors is made up of all volunteers. They're different sorts of areas of agriculture. We have the heads, the directors of the county farm bureaus on our boards of directors, except for Wayne. Wayne stepped off the board not long ago because he's now an employee of the coalition. He's doing member relations, member outreach for us. But we also have Turlock Irrigation District. Mike Nemi is representing the irrigation districts that are in our region. And then we have grape growers, somebody from the fertilizer supply industry, pesticide industry, private consultants and such. So if you know any of these folks, give them your thanks for participating and helping us in this. And then we also have, as non-voting members, we have the county ag commissioners sitting in on our board meetings. They typically pretty much are just listening and providing advice once in a while, but they're non-voting members of the board, as is the Natural Resource Conservation Service with Diane Waller. And then we have a fairly small staff made up of myself, Wayne, Mike Johnson's crew, Jennifer Sanchez, who you met in there, and then our newest addition to the coalition, Katie Camptonico, who many of you have met, is helping us with grower outreach. So one of the things that you've noticed, obviously, this is an annual dues-paying membership organization. Our dues have been able to stay flat, in part because we gained about 150,000 acres out of this groundwater addition to the program. So the dues have stayed at $3.75. We expect them to stay at that level. The big unknown right now is that 75 cents per acre is paid to the State Water Board to cover the cost of I call them the bureaucrats, the people that work at the state and regional water boards. So that amount right now is 75. When we started 10 years ago, it was 13 cents. So you can see a little trend there in what's going on with that. I have no idea what to say about where that 75 cents an acre is going to go. But for now, for this year and for next year, my understanding is going to stay at 75 cents per acre. Now, one thing that our board of directors does not have is patience for non-members and people that have been dodging this program for 5 to 10 years. And in part, many of them are dues-paying members. So they have set a policy now that if somebody wants to join the coalition and they've been notified by the regional board about the coalition, they're going to pay a pretty stiff membership initiation plus some of the back dues. So it's about $16.50 an acre for somebody to come in now and join. Now, if you just buy ground and you just start out, you don't have to pay these back dues. If you're a member and you add acres, that doesn't apply to you. But if somebody all of a sudden says, I didn't know that coalition was there, which is hard to believe, they are going to pay a fairly stiff amount to be part of the organization. And the rationale behind that is, look, members have been paying into this for 10 to 12 years. We've got an established organization. We need you to buy into this, and it's really an equity issue. So that's why you see some of these higher numbers. Now, if somebody got a letter from the regional board that finally chased them into the organization, they also going to have to pay $200 to the state to get into the coalition. That's a state fee. So there are still people out there dodging this membership, and the regional board's not messing around anymore. There was already been 2 fines, one for $8,000, another for $32,000 for a person that got 3 letters and a certified mail from the regional board that says, how are you going to get coverage? They threw them in the trash. These guys caught up with them and they fined the heck out of them. There are now 2 pending fines for $31,000 and $51,000 for growers who have avoided this program and now have to deal with the regional board. Now, they have the ability to appeal these fines and they to lessen them, but right now they're on the street are 2 fines that were announced in January for non-participants in the program who have not responded to regional board requests for representing how they're going to be covered under this irrigated lands program. So the growers can pay that fine, they can appeal it, they can stand in front of the board and appeal that decision, which is what we suggest to anybody that's in this situation. You don't want to blow them off. In fact, one grower didn't even show up at the hearing in December. I think it was about a $15,000 fine. They increased it to $31,000 because the guy didn't even bother to show up. So this is something that you don't want to ignore. These guys are making an example of growers in our coalition region for the rest of the Central Valley, and they're not messing around with this. So just talking about now the membership responsibilities, kind of a review for all of you. This is going to apply to everybody in the Central Valley at some point. We're the first, but these requirements are going to be required of everyone. One of them is to complete the farm evaluation survey. Many of you have done that now for the second year. It's 100% requirement of all the members. This is just a survey or a compilation of the BMPs that you're using on your farm. And then you're going to need to complete a nitrogen management plan. And in a high vulnerability area, a year from now, you're going to need to sit down with a certified crop advisor to have him sign off on that nitrogen management plan. Now, the plan that you have in front of you or that you got in the mail does not need to be turned into us. This is for your own plans, your own file. Next winter, we're going to send you a questionnaire, and there's 2 or 3 numbers yet to be determined that we will ask you to send to us. Things like your APNs, the crop that you have in the acres, and for sure the amount of nitrogen that's put on, and we're not sure about the other numbers. So once a year, we're going to come to you after the crop season and ask you to send us these individual numbers. But the actual plan that you have in front of you right now does not need to be turned into us. We don't want it. So we've had a lot of questions about that. So the other thing is with the nitrogen management plan in the low vulnerability areas, and again, that's designated when we mail this to you, the low vulnerability areas are not going to be required to be certified. So again, keep it on the file. If the water board ever shows up at your door, they're going to say, show us your nitrogen management plan. And that's the only time you would need to present that to anyone. Now, the other thing that's going to be required of growers in certain areas is a sediment and erosion control plan. And that is, generally speaking, anybody that's farming east of the Oakdale-Waterford Highway up in those lower foothills that are in rolling ground are going to need to fill out a sediment and erosion control plan. And that will, again, be kept on the farm. It doesn't get turned into us. If there's ever an incident where the water board shows up and they've seen sediment coming off your farm, they're going to want to see that sediment erosion control plan. You will be getting a template for that in the next month or two, something that you fill out and you can keep on your farm. Now, part of that drove that requirement was an incident about 5 years ago where there was a grower that discharged into the Tuolumne River some pretty hefty sediment loads. And because of that, and the ensuing fine of about $400,000, the regional board has really been focusing on sediment discharges off those lower foothills. And we've had some meetings about that and trying to give growers a heads up. Because when there's a major rain event, the regional board, Fish and Wildlife, jump in an airplane and fly up and down that lower Sierra foothills looking for sediment plumes coming off of fields. And they have people on the ground, they will call them and they will go look and try to identify where's that sediment coming from. So I would very much advise when we get those plans, fill those things out and try to keep that sediment on your farm, because that's the main concern, is sediment loading in our main tributaries, Merced, Tuolumne, and Stanislaus rivers, as well as the tributaries. Then the other thing is that there is more time for 60 an acre smaller growers. Your total membership is 60 acres and smaller. There's some extended times to turn in these requirements in the low vulnerability areas, not the high vulnerability. And we're going to be sending a letter, you'll all be getting this probably next week, that defines this in much more detail. There's really a minority of our members that fall under this, but there is more time provided for them. And then this one requirement, you all are fulfilling this, is our 1 meeting a year requirement. Again, this is something that's going to be required of all the members of coalitions in the whole Central Valley to participate in one of these outreach events so that so you're familiar with all the things that are coming down. So why the focus on nitrates? I mean, the nitrogen management plan is really a spin-off of extremely high levels of nitrates in groundwater in many regions of the Central Valley, not just in our area. And it kind of started out in 2003 when this program was adopted. We knew groundwater was coming. Fortunately, the regional board said, let's do surface water first, come back to groundwater. Now on the Central Coast, they did both right away, but in our area, they split it in two. So we knew it was coming. Then about in 2012, a report came out of UC Davis. We call it the Thomas Harder Report, and I'll show you the title in a minute. That just was like throwing gasoline on a fire. It had some information that came out that said that ag was the major contributor to nitrates in groundwater. This hit the legislature and the water boards, and then at the same time, there's an activist community out there right now that's really pushing, they call it the Disadvantaged Community Lobby, and they are really pushing Sacramento to tax fertilizer so they can create a fund to use for replacing wells in small communities that are contaminated with nitrates. So there's been a tremendous amount of pressure in Sacramento to do something about nitrates in groundwater. So that's in part why you see the reporting requirements and other things. And if there's something good that came out of the drought, there's only one thing, and that's that it derailed that fertilizer tax that was almost ready to be implemented about 2 years ago. Sacramento shifted their focus to the drought. They kind of put this on the side burner, this tax of fertilizer. But from my understanding of those that live in Sacramento or live this stuff, we're going to see that. We're not out of the woods. It's seen a dramatic increase of nitrogen fertilizer to pay for the replacement of the water that's been contaminated ostensibly by nitrogen fertilizer. So here's the technical report that came out of UC Davis. It was a report to the legislature. It came out of the State Water Board. It had some very damning findings for irrigated agriculture. Probably the biggest one is charts similar to this, where they attributed the nitrates in groundwater to fertilizer. And this was a pretty extensive study done by University of California, so it had a lot of credibility. The legislature has a hold of this, the Water Board does, and they are not backing off of putting pressure on the use of nitrogen fertilizer. So this report that you have now, without a doubt, is the first step. I don't think we've seen the end of this. Now, the other thing that came out of this Thomas Harder report were some recommendations how to deal with this problem. Right? You know, what is the Water Board, state legislature going to do to remedy these problems? One of them is they instructed CDFA, Department of Food and Agriculture, to form a task force to develop a tracking and reporting system for nitrogen fertilizer. In part, what you have in your hands came out of that. But more importantly is they charged the State Water Board to form an expert panel. And this is a group of agronomists, not regulators. They pose them some scientific questions about where does nitrogen come from, how do you measure it in the groundwater, how do you determine the source, the transport, et cetera, a number of things. And so there was 10 participants. Again, there was no regulators on it. It was all agronomists, scientists, geologists. In fact, one of our board members, Bill Brush, was on this expert panel. It helped in the deliberations and report. But the reason I tell you about this is there was a recommendation that came out of the expert panel about reporting nitrogen fertilizer. And they recommended, and we in a lot of ways agree, to not just report nitrogen applied to the field. And what they've come up with and recommended is a ratio of nitrogen applied compared to nitrogen removed. Now, this is a complicated thing for many crops because we don't really know if I put 100 units of N, does that crop take off 100 units? Because if it doesn't, the only place that nitrates can go generally is into the groundwater. It takes time, but it eventually could make it to the groundwater. So this approach we think is good because if we just did nitrogen applied, you think about the numbers. We have 1 million acres of irrigated land in our coalition region. If you put on 100 units of N per acre, and it varies all over the board, that's 100 million pounds of nitrogen fertilizer. That's a huge number in anybody's book. But that's not the truth about what's going into groundwater because obviously the crop consumes nitrogen to grow the crop. So this AR is going to get to, this AR ratio is going to try to put into context not only the nitrogen we apply, but the amount of nitrogen the crop takes off. And this is going to be a difficult undertaking to determine exactly for our crops what is AR. And I would tell you now, the crop that has the best information is the almond board, the almond industry. They've done more work on this, and they have a pretty good idea. If you get 1,000 pounds of nut meats, it takes about this much nitrogen to get that. So you can figure out that you stay as close as you can as 1 to 1. The amount applied is the amount that's taken off. Because in the water board's mind, again, they're thinking if you're putting on more than that crop can take up, then it's going into groundwater. And so what we are charged with doing in agriculture is figure out what is the correct ratio, what is the correct A over R that is both protective of your yields and your production on one hand, but on the other hand doesn't leave excess nitrogen in the soil profile so that can be leached into groundwater. Because again, that's where the problems start, is in the groundwater with these levels that are above the drinking water standard. The thing of it is, and they recommended, is that we'll average these over a series of years. And in fact, if you look on your form, your nitrogen management plan, there's a little line in there that says nitrogen removed. We don't have to report that yet, but the Water Board insisted we put it in these forms because they said eventually you're going to have to report that, growers. So get used to seeing that. We don't know what it is yet, and we're going to be doing studies on that to figure that out, but that is where we're going to put on how much nitrogen was removed when you produce 3,000 pounds of almonds or whatever your crop is. So that's where this thing is going, is this AR ratio. We got to make it fairly easy to calculate. We don't all want to have to hire a PhD to figure out our AR ratio, so it's got to be fairly straightforward. We got to make it consistent so we compare numbers within crops. We can't have this group and this soil type doing one calculation. Maybe there's modifiers, but we need to make it a uniform reporting. And then we just need to demonstrate that our nitrogen management practices are protective of groundwater. I mean, that's the banner over and over. Are your practices protective of groundwater and surface water for that matter? So what we're going to be doing with this data collection is that we want to obviously do it crop specific. We want to integrate it regionally. It provides basis of comparisons from year to year. Gives us an idea what's going on in trends. I mean, trends is what this is going to be focused on, not 1 year or 2 years out of several. And we're starting this year, it's going to be the baseline for that. And then it's going to be the basis for outreach and information development that we will then in turn come back to growers on what we learn and how we're going to go forward with this. So the one thing about this that is different from pesticide use reports, it's going to be once a year. It's not going to be a monthly report. We're going to come back to you again next winter. Give us your information from your whole crop season, and then we're going to evaluate it on a multi-year basis, whether it's the ARR. Again, we don't know if that's going to be the approach that we do, and then it's going to take a number of years. And the regional board gets this. We got to have a few years of data. You can't get the first year and make judgments and make decisions based on that alone. The other thing that we've been able to do that I've got 20 acres over in eastern Fresno County. I've been doing pesticide use reports for 20 years, long like all you else, and what I did not want to do is get this down on the pesticide use reporting field block like we have to do for our products. For pesticide products. So we are able to do, if a grower prefers, to do a management unit. In other words, if I've got 1,000 acres of almonds and I do the same thing on that 1,000 acres, that's one report. But if I've got it split into different nitrogen amounts or different practices, then those management units will be reported separately. But this is, again, we're not going to have to do it on a field-by-field basis unless you want to. Unless you want to do it, it's easier for your management, then you can do it in that way. But I think this is going to help a lot from a paperwork reduction standpoint. And the flexibility of this enables us just to group these fields together where we're doing like practices. And when you start looking at these numbers, and I'll go over them in a minute, is estimate, because there's a lot of things, not the amount applied, but some of these that were estimates are going to be appropriate. And so the basic elements, and I'm going to go over this in a second here, is the basic elements is the crop, the fields or the parcels that are identified. Each one will need to be identified on the report, the nitrogen applied, and then estimates of nitrogen in your irrigation water, in the compost and manure, and the carryover residual in soils. And then in a year from now, then a CCA is going to sit down and review these things with you as you fill out this report. So the high vulnerability areas, sorry, in the back, I don't know if you can see this. And this is going to be, these maps will be in your annual report that you're going to be getting shortly from us that identify where these high vulnerability areas are. Pretty much everywhere east of or west of Highway 99 is going to be high vulnerability. You can also see that on your nitrogen management plan when we send you the list of APNs. So you'll see those designations. But you can see most of the area west of the highway is high vulnerability. And the three components, Mike will go over this, is sandy soils, shallow groundwater, and existing nitrate levels. Those three combined or individually can put you in a high vulnerability area. Okay, so here's the plan, the nitrogen template. Again, took 3 years to get it down to 1 page, but I will go through this section by section. We got an introduction on the front, gives you a little bit of the regulatory background on what it is. The center is just kind of an instruction sheet. Each number is going to correspond to a cell, gives you a little definition of what's going into each one of those boxes. It's highlighted. Now let me point out, if you go to the website of the regional board and you download that template, which looks it's identical to this, these instructions are not going to match. When we went out and did the layout for this, the 20 didn't match with the 20 on the page. It was clear around the other side. So I won't go into the details, but don't look at the directions the regional board sent you to match these numbers. They're the same directions, but they're reordered. We've already had some folks do that and see that it got confused from that. But anyway, if you just use what we send you, pretty straightforward. Okay, then on the back, each of the sections on the top is going to be your crop and your member information. That's your APNs, the field IDs that you designate yourself. Here it is blown up. So the field ID, you make that up. That's not something that we assign. You can use your pesticide use report field IDs that are on your report if you want, or you can call it home ranch or a river ranch or whatever you want to call it, the number of acres in that management unit, and then your name and your member ID, et cetera, that member information. Then the nitrogen management planning, that's over there on the far left. This is your crop, the production unit that you're going to be reporting, you're going to be estimating your AR in, it's usually pretty straightforward in your industry. Almonds you get paid by the pound, and some crops by the ton, and it's bales with cotton, et cetera. So you designate that. And you guess right now what your yield's going to be for this coming year. And this again is an estimate, it is a guess. All right, so we got a good bloom in almonds, probably going to get 3,000. I got 4,000 last year, probably going to be light, so I'm going to get probably about 3,000 pounds. On my peaches and nectarines that I'm growing, I know roughly what I'm going to get, but the idea is then we make a projection of what your yield's going to be. And this is more for the CCA conversation later of, okay, if I'm going to get 3,000 pounds of almonds, we know that how many pounds of nitrogen it takes to get 3,000 pounds. So that's why this estimate is important. And then what's the recommended amount of nitrogen to get that production? Almonds we know pretty well. The university, farm advisors, your crop advisor, your fertilizer salesman can tell you most of the time what's the amount of N it takes you to get that anticipated production. So the idea with this is, where this came back to this gentleman over here has a lot of good points, is the water board doesn't think we think about this stuff. So they think, well, yeah, they just go out and they buy it and it's cool, it's white, so I'm going to put a lot on. I mean, seriously. So what this is about is we thought about what I think my yield is going to be, what it's going to take to get that yield, and this is a planning approach. Okay, so then the next thing we've got here on the bottom is post-production actuals. This is something that end of the season, next winter, again, I use almonds a lot, but you come back next fall, this is the amount of yield that I got off, and we're going to give you a translator because your 2,000 pounds of nut meats doesn't include the kernels and the hulls. So we're going to have some translators for these that we have to develop. The total amount of N that was applied, that comes over from the other side of the sheet. I'll go over that in a minute. And then the N removed. This is the thing that we don't know yet how it's going to be reported, but that's why it's got a star on it. And then very important for this, as we go on, the notes section. So if you've got, I think I'm going to get 3,000 pounds. Well, you get maybe every one of those blooms set, you end up with 4,000 pounds. That's where you say, I'm getting a larger crop, so I'm putting on more nitrogen. Or you get the June drop, everything fell off. I thought I was going to get 3,000, I got 500 pounds out there. So this is where you're documenting the changes that you anticipated in March. And this is going to be very important. It doesn't need to be 15 pages of narrative, just notes that say, I made these adjustments because things didn't happen like I thought in March. Is that a question? Okay, the question is, if you're a member and you lease it to somebody else, make sure as the member you give it to your leaseholder to turn in. Don't both of you do this. Really, the responsibility is the guy farming the ground. That's where this ultimately needs to go. So try to make sure that your renter, your whoever's farming your ground, they are the one that should be filling this out. So the other things to note: weather change. We got a frost here and blew all my flowers off, pest damage, expected yield, et cetera. I mean, this is the place that we would use to document some anomaly that may put you in a different production basis. Okay, and then the other side, this is the nitrogen applied. What you start out with is the dry and liquid that you might apply. And before I go into this, if you got irrigated pasture and you don't put anything on, you got it easy. You put big fat zeros in all of these, so don't worry about it. If you're not fertilizing, zeros are an okay answer. Okay, so here's the dry liquid that you put on, foliar N, that goes into this applied nitrogen, organic N. If you're putting compost on, just got finished putting 5 ton of compost on, and it tested out about 30 units of N, but what you got to keep in mind, we all know this, 30 units of N is not this year. You maybe have 20 this year, 10 next year, and 10 the following year. Again, estimate. But the numbers for both compost and manure, you got to figure those over a longer period of time because they are not all available. At least what I've been told from research, they're not all available at once. Okay, then you have the total amount of N applied. Then you have your N credits, available N carryover in the soil. Many of our mineral soils don't have much, if any, N carryover. But again, estimate what you think that might be. And then N in irrigation water. Especially you guys on the west side of the 99, you may not know this. You got a lot of free fertilizer in your irrigation water that you don't got to buy because it's already down there from who knows where. But anyway, if you want to test your well, it's not mandatory at this point. It's a recommended practice because you can take off from your applied what's in your nitrogen in your irrigation water. Why put on more than what your tree needs or vine or whatever if there's nitrogen available in your groundwater? Now there's a little efficiency factor you got to figure in there. It's not one for one, but just the idea behind this is Thomas Harder, back to Thomas Harder, coined a term that you're going to hear forevermore in farming, pump and fertilize, pump and fertilizer. They got that in Sacramento so much that we are now going to, we have that as a BMP, pump and fertilize and take advantage of that nitrogen that's in that irrigation water. And you need to annualize it. Again, that's going to be an estimate. What I put 3 acre-feet on my almonds. So 3 acre-feet, 20 parts per million, that equals 100 pounds. So, you know, roughly you make an estimate out of that 100 pounds and you can work it with a CCA to figure this out of how many pounds that are actually going to be used by your crop. Gentlemen.
If you're solely using district water, is the MID, PID going to have that information available, or are I going to have to take a sample at our...
Let's see if I can see my TID guy. I don't know. Do the districts sample their irrigation water and have a rough idea what surface water is? Yeah, so to repeat his answer, they are doing testing this side of 99, and the way the systems are is they're accumulating nitrogen as they move to the west. If you're by the foothills, you're probably getting no nitrates in your surface water, but some of these canals are supplemented with crown water. You're going to be picking up some higher levels as you go this way. But generally, this side of the river, you can count on nothing in that surface water.
Or are you going to have a slip of paper somewhere saying PID says it's...
Well, again, this is an estimate that you're trying to take account for it. I don't think, I just about guarantee the water board's not going to come over there and say, well, your water, where's your ppm? This is maybe down the road, but now this is your ppm, you didn't take advantage of it. Right now, the idea with this, as much as anything, is start thinking about this in your planning. Especially in these well water areas when you're on this side of the river. My gosh, we're seeing 300 parts per million water over there. Some crops you don't even need to fertilize, they got so much nitrogen in the groundwater. The idea is take that into account in your planning. And this is, again, back to this gentleman over here. Probably a lot of guys are doing that already, but we don't have any record that says growers are doing that. So we need this information as we go forward to try to show our professionalism in farming. Okay, so then we come back to here at the our estimate on irrigation water, so your total N credits, so you've got this total plus this total equals this, and this is, when you go back to number 9 on your left-hand side, that's your total applied N on that crop per management unit for that year. And then that's going to be compared to what you take off at the end of the year. And right now, there's no right answer for any of this. I've had growers say this, and I just say it to you guys, is say, what numbers you want me to put in there? You put in what you do. There's no right or wrong answer here. You put in what you do so we start getting an idea what it is that's happening out in the field. Okay, so plant certification, pretty self-explanatory. When you're in a high vulnerability area, you're going to need a CCA to sign off that, clear at the bottom. If not, then you don't need that. And the CCA is Nitrogen Management Plan Specialist. Sorry, the Water Board doesn't want to just put CCA there, but that falls under the Certified Crop Advisors, the Nitrogen Management Plan Specialist. Okay, so just a simple illustration. Again, if this is almonds and grapes, and you farm these the same, that's one report. But if that block, and that block are all different, there's 3 reports. Grapes obviously would be different. So this is just trying to simplify the amount of paperwork and reports that you have to fill out. And then the plan is a year from now, next winter, you're going to give us this summary or this information on those fields. We're going to aggregate it into a township report. It's not going to have everybody's individual name on it. So we're going to get a township. All the almonds will be this amount, grapes will be this amount, and that's the aggregated report that then goes into the regional board. One other thing I want to just point out is, as you know with groundwater, it's a really tough thing to inspect. I mean, surface water, you drive around, you see a creek with mud in it or something, an inspector will see that. Groundwater, it's very difficult to see something visually. However, when you talk about wellheads, that I think is going to be something I would give you a heads up on. Make your wellhead as clean as you possibly can so nobody is going to want to stop and inspect it. I mean, this is the windshield inspectors driving around these counties are going to be looking for reasons to stop. And if your wellhead is clean, there's no pesticide containers, it's all dry around there, then don't give them an excuse to stop, especially if you're near a busy road where somebody might be driving by. The other thing that I would give you a heads up on is these pictures were taken on a tour of some water board staffers, and the thing that this water board person zoomed right in on was that standing water, which was the flush water from that drip system. And this guy made the point that that's probably, and you could tell by looking at it when we were out there, it had been wet for months because the flush water had gone out there and it just never dried out. And he said, well, that's a conduit. That could be a conduit to that wellhead that's right there. And if you had a fertilizer spill, that would be a conduit down to your well casing and possibly to groundwater. So I'm just guessing. I'm not seeing this in writing anywhere, but again, make your wellheads as clean as you possibly can. Grade them away so if any water is excess water is coming off a storm, it doesn't go around the wellhead. But just good wellhead housekeeping. I think we're going to be in the world of backflow preventers on our wellheads when you have a pressurized system. Some counties already have that requirement. Most of the new systems have them on that, but I believe in a few years it's going to be a mandatory backflow if you have a drip system or micro sprinklers to prevent that. Power goes off and you're doing fertigation, it might suck that into the wellhead. So that's another thing that's good to look forward. Abandoned wells, not sure what to say about that. You're having to report them. There are some that believe those are conduits down into groundwater. So just keep in mind, if you've got an abandoned well, that you need to get that abandoned properly. There's one other requirement. Again, this guy started and got me going here on our management practices. For years, we were telling him, look, we're doing this stuff right. We're not leaking past the root zone. And the water board said, all right, show us your data. Where's your studies that show you when you're doing your management practices, there's nothing going past the groundwater. Other than almonds, we don't have any of those studies. There's very little in the literature globally that we can say there's been studies done 10 feet below the root zone, nothing's going past there. So the water board said, because we didn't have the data, said, all right, you're going to do a management practice effectiveness program. You coalitions are going to go provide the data that says that your practices are protective of groundwater. So we formed a coordinated effort amongst the coalitions from Fresno North, East San Joaquin, West Side, Delta, and Sac Valley. We're combining efforts, and we have a plan due this summer. Research is going to start next year, where we're literally going to go find an almond orchard, or probably not almonds because they did the work. We'll find corn and grapes and say, do the best you can, and then we're going to use soil probes and lysimeters, follow that crop through the year, and prove that there's not nitrogen fertilizer going past the root zone. And we're hoping like crazy when we do that we're not finding any leakage into groundwater. And if we do, then we modify the practices, figure out a way to prevent that nitrogen from moving past the root zone. So this is going to be a huge undertaking. We're going to be telling you results about this for 5 years. I'm guessing 10 years before we get all the answers on this. But this is an undertaking that's begun with the Northern coalitions.
Good morning. Thank you for all coming. I'd like to thank Perry and the East San Joaquin Water Coalition for inviting me to come as well. I'm going to talk about 5 topics. What are CCAs and how do we can benefit you? Why this agricultural nitrogen has now become a problem. I've had an opportunity to travel in the world in the Central Valley, so I'll compare those observations. And how we fix this problem. We're going to talk about the 4 R's of nitrogen management. And then I'm going to suggest some questions that you might ask your CCAs when you work up your nitrogen management plans. Before I do that, who am I? Well, I'm a private agricultural consultant. I'm CCA 63839. I've worked in a variety of crop venues and a number of locations here in California, in Mexico and South America, also North Africa and China. Spent a lot of time traveling the world. A long time ago, I graduated from Cal Poly. My main area of interest is in soil fertility and irrigation water chemistry and plant nutrition. So what is a CCA? Well, the program was started in 1992. It's sponsored by the American Society of Agronomy. We are looked upon as a standard for judging professional expertise in agronomy around the world. The CCA sign-off is now a requirement for your nitrogen management plans. We have to take tests both locally and internationally to demonstrate our expertise. We also involve ourselves in continuing education units to keep up to date on new developments. And we have to sign a code of ethics and adhere to that code of ethics for the benefit of growers. Our interest is in serving growers and allowing you to get the best bang for your buck on the advice we provide. Now, why is agricultural nitrogen now thought to be a problem? Well, the first thing is we're finding that the nitrogen is just in the wrong place. It's in groundwater, and we're measuring exceedances in groundwater, and that's not what anybody wants. Farmers don't want it because it costs money, and society doesn't want it because it can make people sick. The federal EPA and the state water board have established maximum contaminant levels, MCLs. It's expressed as 45 parts per million nitrate, NO3, or 10 parts per million nitrate N, NO3-N. It's the same amount of nitrogen, it's just two different ways to express it. It's like saying 6 or half a dozen. Now this is the problem. All of these red areas that go from the Mexican border all the way up into the border with Oregon are where the exceedances are occurring. Excess nitrate in groundwater is occurring where people live and in our agricultural areas. Now, nitrate is an anion. That's a chemical term. It means it's got a negative electrical charge. Soils also have a negative electrical charge. They kind of repel each other. Nitrate moves with water. So where the water goes, the nitrate's also going to go. We also need to consider timing of application. If we're applying nitrogen when the trees are dormant or where we're in a pre-plant situation, there's no crop growing, it's not likely that trees are going to take up anything if they're dormant and leafless. Now, what do I see around the world? One of the things that's interesting is that international growers are kind of up against it. They do not have the benefit of the blessings that we enjoy here in the valley. They've got adverse soil types, adverse water chemistry, sometimes they've got specific element toxicities, and they have, in many cases, lousy climates. It's hard for these growers, and what they're doing is they're taking advantage of every kind of technology they can find to remain competitive in an international marketplace. They're trying to reduce their fertilizer bill, and they're trying to avoid wasted fertilizer below the root zone. A lot of them are going from intermittent fertigation to a concept called proportional flow fertigation. Australia and Spain and certainly Israel are countries that are emerging as leaders in this area. There's an entrepreneurial opportunity here in California to embrace this kind of technology. With proportional flow fertigation, we're trying to control the nutrient element concentration in the soil water. We want to control the parts per million of nitrogen in that water. The water is applied with uniformly dosed fertilizer in all of the water, and the concentration is generally substantially lower in terms of rate as compared with traditional rates. And we measure the amount of water we apply. Now, what do I see in the Central Valley? I don't see very much discussion about concentration, discussing parts per million in the soil water. It's generally units per acre or pounds per acre. There's some uncertainty about the uniformity of application of both water and nitrogen particularly across the field and at depth. We probably need to measure soil nitrate, and Perry's mentioned a little bit about that, both within the root zone and below the root zone. There's a practice called, this is a term not invented by me, but one of my clients mentioned it. He calls it slam injection. and that practice perhaps needs to be improved. So how do we fix this? We're embracing an idea called the 4 R's. That's the right rate, the right place, the right time, and the right source. If we implement these principles, we think we can get a better handle on our nitrate management. So CCAs apply their knowledge to manage the right rate, the right source, the right time, and the right place. And we try to ensure that we're not over-fertilizing crops and that the fertilizer stays within the root zone. And this should benefit your bottom line. Now this is a crop consumption curve. There's no units on this, but this is for almonds. The reason I have this here is I want to point out right here in the beginning of the season, the trees are dormant. There's very little uptake of nitrogen, if any. And then it starts to occur as trees bloom and leaf out and continues on until harvest, and then it drops off substantially. There's no real need to apply nitrogen this time, nor in this time. The same can be applied to tomatoes, row crops. Where we have nothing planted, there's no need for that, for applying nitrogen there. It begins slowly, and then as the plants develop and go into vegetative stage and growing vigorously, the demand increases. We're trying to match the application to the crop demand. Notice that this falls off quite abruptly right after fruit set in early red fruit. So we need to know our crop demand, and that's an estimate. Perry mentioned the fact that we're estimating some of these for many crops. We're going to get better at it as we go. We want to sum the inputs from residual soil nitrogen, from water, and from organic matter. And then we subtract these from the sum of those from crop demand. And then we add fertilizer in to satisfy the deficit. We may have to add an efficiency factor to ensure that we've got adequate nitrogen. Efficiency factors are in a state of flux now. We're trying to work out how those will be applied. If we're fertigating, we want to consider measuring the nutrient element concentration in the water. Now, right time, we apply this when we have high crop demand. Spring and early summer are typical. There's no need to apply nitrogen when their trees are dormant. Another feature is that there's a relationship between water demand and nitrogen uptake. When the trees stop taking water, it can also uptake fertilizer. As leaf crop mass increases, so does the nitrogen demand. So we need to review our crop consumption curve for the crops of interest. We need to place this fertilizer in the root zone and not below it. We need to make adjustments for field uniformity. If soil type varies across a field a lot, we may want to consider managing smaller units and breaking those fields up. We should also consider depth of root zone and soil type. Now we know that the law of the minimum that Liebig suggested many years ago limits the ultimate productivity of crops, but it's also the case that if we have sufficient supply of all nutrients, we improve nitrogen efficiency uptake. We can also consider that other forms of nitrogen are important. Ammonium is a cation. It's got a positive electrical charge. It does adhere to the surface of soil clays and organic matter, and it takes a little bit of time, depending on the situation, for that to mineralize to nitrate. So we can store a little bit of nitrogen as ammonium that won't leach as easily as nitrate does. Now, Perry mentioned it too, and I want to emphasize this. Groundwater nitrogen is a useful source of fertility. We should make use of that. We need to determine the concentration of nitrate in our water, and then we can use this example to give you an idea how important this is. If we have a well water that has 35 parts per million nitrate in, and we want to apply 30 acre inches in a season, we can start with 35 parts per million times this factor of 0.225. That's going to be north of about 7 pounds of nitrogen per acre inch. And if we apply 30 acre inches, we've got 236 pounds of N in that water per acre. It's often the case that the groundwater nitrogen is your cheapest source of nitrogen. This is real green money. It's probably better to keep it in your pocket than below the root zone. So this contribution to the nitrogen budget should be subtracted from your crop demand. We don't have to buy it. We don't have to apply it because it's already there. We just have to make use of it in a proper way. Now, if we want to talk about green money, we can take that 236 pounds of N from the groundwater, and that's equal to a little bit more than 500 pounds of urea or 700 pounds of UAN32. And if the cost of those fertilizers are these numbers, we're talking about $115 to $136 per that application for each acre applied. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about spoon feeding. That's a term that's used often. I've got a specific definition for that. But before I say something about spoon feeding, I want to mention that split applications are useful. And they can be 2, 3, or 4 or more applications during the growing season, during the period of highest crop demand. If we go to spoon feeding, in this sense, we're talking about applying low rates of nitrogen, anywhere in the range of 1 to 20 pounds per acre, frequently, maybe once a week, or even at every irrigation. Now, spoon feeding strives to manage the nutrient element concentration in the soil water. We're interested in knowing what the ppm-N is in that water. Now, this is a figure that I've taken from the Western Fertilizer Handbook. It describes soil moisture relations, but I'm going to repurpose this a little bit because I want to bring your attention to this water here, and this water in this soil pore, and this water can all have nitrogen in it, and we should know what the concentration of that nitrogen is in that water. So this type of fertilizing is not for everybody. There is a learning curve that one has to confront. The minimum amount of fertilizer is applied to maintain normal leaf tissue concentrations. We can convert to pounds per acre or units per acre, as we did in the previous slides. In summary, we need to adopt a balanced approach to this. We should implement the 4 R's principles: the right rate, the right source, the right time, and the right place. We need to sum up all the nitrogen inputs from groundwater, from residual soil nitrogen, and from organic matter, and subtract that from our estimated crop demand. We supply the remaining deficit from fertilizer in, and we may have to use an efficiency factor to make sure we have good yield. Make use of your CCAs. Use their expertise. We're confident you'll have superior yield with good nitrogen use efficiency. Now, some questions you might want to consider asking your CCAs include: the CCAs that are able to sign off on a nutrient management plan have a nitrogen management certificate within their CCA certification. Ask them if they have that. Ask also if your wells exceed the maximum contaminant levels, and how can you effectively improve nitrogen management on your place. Ask the CCA if he will assist with preparing your nitrogen management plan. Important to ask, how are we going to ensure superior yields when we're lowering our nitrogen application rate? You need to also ask them what their policy is with regard to confidentiality of information. And most of all, ask them what it costs. Thanks very much.
I'm Bill Green with the Center for Irrigation Technology at Fresno State, and talking a little bit about pump and irrigation system performance. That's related to how the nitrates move in the soil, depending on how you irrigate. So we're going to take a little time to talk about that this morning. We do educational seminars on campus all the time regarding water use efficiency and movement of water in the soil and that sort of thing, and how to try to use water as efficiently as possible. Obviously, in the drought, it's a major issue. I'm also a farmer in the Fresno area, so I also have many of the same issues you're dealing with. Obviously, we know that nitrates move in the soil with the water, and that they're pretty soluble, and so they move quickly. Other nutrients get bound to the soil particles, different charges and things, but nitrates move pretty easily. And that's why it's a very important concern to try to maintain a balance and water in that root profile. The effective root zone is what we call it. We need to discuss how that's related to the irrigation system performance, because one of the things that's happening right now with the drought, especially with deep well pumps, is that they're changing. The flow rates are dropping off. It changes how the irrigation system performs, particularly pressurized irrigation systems. So that's why it's so important. And it's important to understand that the pump needs to be matched properly to the irrigation system Every pressurized irrigation system, when it's designed and installed, has a flow and pressure that's considered what it needs for that proper operation, so that you get good uniformity of the irrigation and application. When you're injecting fertilizers, fertigating, they're going to go where the water goes. So if you don't have a nice even application of water, it's going to affect how well you're going to fertilize. And if you have spots where there's excessive water delivery, those are going to potentially leach past the root zone. Now, when we install irrigation systems, and when I was in farm management all those years and stuff, I did this a lot, we kind of assume when we put a drip system in that it's 100% uniform. Well, that's just not the case. And in fact, we're going to talk a little bit further about that, but there's a lot of cases where your uniformity is not that good at all, particularly in older systems when maintenance and other issues are involved. We also do stuff when it comes with, on campus, our scheduling tools. We maintain a site called WaterRight for the Department of Water Resources. That's another tool you could use. Online's free for scheduling irrigations. It helps use evapotranspiration rates and crop coefficients to properly schedule your irrigations. And then the last thing is getting your pumps tested. If you're a PG&E customer, we run the Advanced Pumping Efficiency Program at Fresno State for PG&E. And in fact, there's brochures back on the back table and stuff that involves getting your pumps tested, and we have money to help repair them too. If you're not a PG&E customer on that particular pump, then you're not eligible. Still doesn't mean it's not a good idea to get your system tested. So we know that pumps are going to deliver water to these different irrigation systems. You know, there's different pictures here. You have furrow, or you have high-pressure sprinklers, drip, center pivots, fan jets. All these different systems have different flow and pressure requirements that the pump needs to meet. And so matching that is the key, and then maintaining that system so that it works properly. And quite often through our programs, through our testing and things like that, we see where they're not matched very well. So that's why it's so important to get your equipment checked out and to understand what you're trying to accomplish with it. Obviously, then different pumps will deliver different to those different types of irrigation systems. Usually we're looking at the flow rate and the pressure from that pump. The upper left picture there has a deep well pump that's delivering water through a booster pump that's creating pressure to run a drip system. Those have to be matched properly. If the deep well pump falls off in performance, it affects the booster pump. And then again, the whole irrigation system uniformity. On a flood irrigation system, you might have other issues where you're trying to stay off peak or something like that, and the flow rates are dropping off. You're expending more money for your energy. All that works together. The first thing to understand about pumps when they operate is they have what we call, when they operate, an operating condition. Imagine that. An operating condition is that combination of flow and pressure that it's developing. And so that's why when we're trying to size pumps, we're trying to match the system requirement with what your water source will allow and what you need to do to accomplish that. So there's different horsepowers and different pump types, different impellers, all these different things you have to work with to try to do it as efficiently as possible. So like I mentioned before, every pressurized irrigation system has a system requirement to get proper distribution uniformity. We did some testing for PG&E the last few years on some of this sort of thing, and we were testing uniformity in the field. And we got uniformities anywhere from 90%, 92%, very uniform, good systems, all the way down to like 30 or 40%. You'd be better off to flood irrigate on a hillside in that case than use drip. They were that bad. And it was a maintenance issue, a lot of cases, or the pump fell off or some other issue came about that the grower just didn't even realize it. When I was a couple years ago in my own place, our water levels are dropping obviously from the drought issues, and my groundwater pump, I'm watching my flow meter. That's one of the first things you need to have is a flow meter. You should have one of those so you can gauge how much water is coming out all the time. And my flow was starting to fall off. So was the discharge pressure that was feeding my system. I couldn't flush my filter tanks properly. The drip system was not very uniform at that point because I wasn't supplying that proper flow and pressure requirement. So I had the pump tested, I checked it out, I watched my flow meter, I knew this was happening, and it was because the water levels are dropping. When water levels drop, part of the equation for computing pressure of pumps is the total lift of the pump. How many feet of lift do we have from the water source? When the water source goes deeper, that means you have to lift the water farther. That takes away from your discharge pressure, reduces the flow rate, and changes the efficiency of your pump. So a pump doesn't have to wear out. Things like that can occur. And right now we see that occurring all the time in this program. We've tested about 35,000 pumps under this program in the last 12 years. And about a third of all pumps are under 50% efficient, and that's poor. Only a small percentage of those are actually repaired. So it's kind of like, this is why I always relate having flow meters, kind of like to speedometer in your car. If you don't have a speedometer, you may be driving along, you maybe think you're going 55 miles an hour. You might be going pretty close to 55 miles an hour, but it's pretty hard to know if you're going exactly 55 miles per hour. And it feels different in different vehicles. Same thing with a flow meter on a pump. If you have one of those, then you know what your actual rate of application is of water, and you can carefully plan your irrigation strategies around that. If you don't have it, you're just kind of guessing. And that's one of the things that we're trying to take that out of the guesswork out of irrigating and systems. So what we're trying to accomplish, or what we're trying not to accomplish, I suppose, in this case, is poor distribution uniformity. When the irrigation system is not evenly irrigating, and when you have all these different issues, we've gone too deep here in the root zone, we haven't gone deep enough here. If this water is an uneven application across your field, this is much of a simplification, but if it's like that across your field, if you're applying nitrogen, then it's moving the same way the water is. So it's not being all utilized properly. So some of the issues that cause this: poor design. Quite often we've seen in the field that the design work, it's very important to understand when you're getting competing bids what you're looking at with pipe sizing, equipment, that sort of thing. The cheaper bid doesn't necessarily mean it's a better deal, because perhaps the system isn't designed properly. Elevation differences, not a big issue here in the valley, but when you go over in the coast range, it changes the output of that pump. We have different lifts of that pump. It changes how that pump works and the efficiency of it. Okay, poor maintenance, leaks. I don't know what it is, if it's a drought or what, but coyotes have been tearing my system up the last couple of years. They are just chewing my hoses like crazy. They're thirsty, I guess. I think the pups sometimes just like to do it for fun too. But anyway, every time I go out there, I got to repair more lines. Well, if I'm fertigating while I'm doing that, I kind of got a chemical spill right where that leak was now. Applied way too much because a lot of the water and the chemical went there. So improper emitter replacement. I spent a lot of years in farm management, and we'd had fan jet irrigation systems, things like that, sprinklers. It's not uncommon for somebody to see one plugged or something, go in the barn, grab one, go out and replace it. It may not be the same type of emitter. Maybe you had a 6-gallon-hour emitter and they put a 10-gallon-hour emitter on, or vice versa. That affects the uniformity of the system, and again, causes an uneven application of water. Pressure valves not regulated properly. I did a uniformity test on the Fresno State farm last year on some peaches fan jets. It was a new irrigation system, relatively new, well designed, reputable company. Went out there and tested the uniformity, came up with a 0.83 or 83% uniformity, which is okay. But I was surprised. I thought, wow, a new system like this, the pump's in good shape, everything's working well. Why don't we have better uniformity? So we were testing pressures using Cal Poly's protocol. The Irrigation Training Research Center has a protocol for uniformity testing. We used that, and I was testing pressures in the field, and I realized there's two main regulating valves in the field that were controlling it, and one of them was not regulated properly. I spent about 5 minutes recalibrating those pressure sites, those regulating valves. We redid the uniformity test, and it went to 93%, just like that. It took 5 minutes to correct the problem. Somebody had just twisted on the valve and messed it up. It's common things we deal with every day, but you wouldn't notice it. You couldn't have noticed it just by looking at the system. You had to actually do a test to know that. I couldn't tell by looking at the emitters. And then pump flow and pressure, I've already mentioned that an issue that they're not matching the system design. Same thing when you go convert from flood irrigation to drip or something. You should usually change that pump to match the system. So it's important to do that. And poor filter maintenance too. Another example of uniformity. This is where you have good uniformity, but you have poor water management. We've irrigated too long in this particular case, packed the effective root zone. If there's nutrients in that water, we've moved them past that, nitrogen usually. So this is an example of where you have a good working equipment, everything's working properly, but the management issue came into play. It wasn't managed properly. So it's important to understand how far and how fast that water is moving through the soil. Different soil types, it moves at different speeds. What we're trying to accomplish, and it probably seems self-evident, but still, I always make the point, we're trying to accomplish an even application of water that gets the effective root zone wet the way we want to accomplish it, that we don't move nutrients and water past that root zone. A gentleman was mentioning earlier about many farmers under-irrigate. No, that's absolutely true. Many times they do. But if they have a poor working irrigation system, even when they under-irrigate because of poor uniformity, there may be spots in the field where it still moves past the root zone, but they're not very effective in the overall application of water. So unfortunately, that may be why the nitrates are showing up in the water the way they are. And it's just a result of uneven application of water. If you're flood irrigating, if you're 70% uniform, you're doing very well. You're an excellent irrigator. But that's not all that good when you're using drip. So that's why it's important. One of the things we can do is audit the systems. I mentioned earlier Cal Poly's protocol for doing this, the way they've set it up. It includes catch cans and also pressure gauges. One of the things you can do on your drip system is you can take catch cans out there, time it, measure how much water was coming out of each one, do it randomly across the field, see what you got. Do the same thing with pressure gauges too. See what you got. If you've got very uneven application of water, then perhaps you should bring in an expert or somebody to work with to try to alleviate the problem or retrofit the equipment, whatever you need to do. Find out why there's a problem in the first place. This chart here is associated with distribution uniformity. The number we get is called distribution uniformity of the low quarter, DULQ. I'm not going to go into the whole how we do it exactly with pressures and flows. What I want to look at is this chart here and just give you an example of how important this is and how it can affect the performance and irrigation system performance. This shows 4 different parts of the field that were checked. We have the low quarter here where the least amount of water on average was being applied versus the high quarter over here, the green bar, okay? Now, if you look at the chart carefully, it says 100% right there. To get 100% of the water we need in that low quarter, we'd have to apply 160% in the high quarter. This is at 80% uniformity, which is generally considered pretty good. So in other words, get the minimum amount of water you need in that drier part, you're going to have to apply 160% of what you need in the wet part when it comes to 80% uniformity. That's better than you can achieve with flood or furrow, but you would hope with drip and other systems you might be able to beat that, okay? But it's very common, probably we see it often, even with drip systems, they're coming in at 70, 75, 80. Pump fell off or some other issues come out. So the point is if you were fertigating in that case, and you're applying fertilizer evenly, you're applying, say, 50 units of nitrogen through your system. You just assume that everywhere is getting 50 units. Well, probably you're under-irrigating this part of the field and you're over-irrigating this part of the field because of the uniformity aspect. So the fertilizers go in the same place. So you've got a pretty big discrepancy on what's being received out there in different parts of the field. Okay? So it's crucial that you understand that that works that way and that it makes that big a difference when it comes to applying water. So again, poor DU leads to uneven application of water. Could be excessive leaching in some spots. Maybe you're not getting enough in other spots, not getting enough nitrogen, whatever it is. If you're shanking it in with a ranchero and then you're furrow irrigating to get it in like that, again, uneven application of water. Top end of the field is going to get a lot more hours than the bottom end unless you're using some kind of return system so that you can keep recycling to get it more even, but it's very difficult to have that happen. So it's important to know the depth of application of the water. And I usually say we do soil moisture sensors all the time. I've set them up in my field. We use different parts of the field. We try to, different soil types and things, try to gauge how far the water's gone. But it's only a few sites. So it's good to go out there with a soil auger once in a while and check a few other sites too. Somebody would say a backhoe, but I don't have access to backhoe on my farm. So I would just go out with an auger or something like that and check around a little bit. Shovel. Just see how deep you're going with the water. If you have an effective root zone of 3 feet and you dig down, you see water down to 4 feet, then you got a problem. So very important to understand that. Here's that same chart earlier where we over-irrigated and we moved the nitrogen past the root zone. Again, try to control that application. If we have good working equipment, an even application, good distribution uniformity, maintain that nitrogen and nitrates in the root zone so it doesn't end up in the groundwater. The effective root zone, okay? Soil moisture sensors, if you know you have an effective root zone of 4 feet, A lot of times I'll go to 5 feet. But if you know you got the water at 4 feet, know that it's probably gone a little past 4 feet too. Okay, so, but these are the kind of tools you can use. We do seminars on this kind of stuff all the time on campus. You can get automatic feedback to your iPhone or iPad anywhere in the world now. See if your water's running, if it's running properly. You know, all those kind of things can be done to help monitor the system more carefully. This is a chart that shows water movement in different soil types, soil textures. Like most of you, my field has several different types. There's streaks of sand through there that might as well be on the beach, has no water holding capacity at all. Other areas where there's a silt layer or clay layer down below and it's not, the water doesn't move below it very easily. But if you look at this chart carefully here, this is a sandy soil on the left, and it shows the gravitational pull with large pore spaces of water through that soil. And in only 40 minutes time, it's moved almost 36 inches, if you're watering this way. As opposed to a more clay type soil, 36 inches might take 24 hours. So it's very important to understand you're not getting the same water movement, the same infiltration rate in different parts of your ranch. Okay, this doesn't even take soil chemistry into account. There's other issues that cause problems too, plow pans and all kinds of other issues that might cause a problem with water penetration. So very important to understand that. And so when I'm testing for my water movement, my soil, I go to those sandier areas and I try to track it carefully when I'm applying my nitrogen. And I cut it off before I get the bottom of the soil profile. I know in the heavier soil parts, it's not gone below that. At least it shouldn't have. So I'm always checking those spots that are where I know that it's going to infiltrate the quickest.
What volume of water are you putting on?
Well, it just depends. Yeah, that's a good question. It relates to that, and that's why when we do these irrigation scheduling things, we're relating it to our flow meter and how much water is being applied per plant and how fast. With drip, in my case, you're putting on about 1 gallon per hour, 2 half-gallon emitters in my vineyard. You might have fan jets that are putting 10 gallons an hour. So again, you have to know that, but you're also widening this area out where you're applying that water possibly. So it still may not be infiltrating any faster. That's why it's important to use soil moisture sensors, probes, things like that, augers, to find out how quickly it's moving. But every system is different. Every field is different. So it's not an easy answer. Okay, so that chart was a simplification, as most of my charts are. So, but it's a good question because it is a difficult thing to deal with. Again, we do irrigation scheduling. We have waterright.org. It's a free website. If you're interested, you can go online and you put in your information from your irrigation system. We do seminars at Fresno State. Cal Poly also does stuff. Obviously, cooperative extension. We have all these different tools we can to help us do a little bit of our job. And so if we're a little more efficient with our water and our nitrogen, it will be more important. Like Bill was talking about earlier, I like the spoon feeding concept. I used to grow fresh peaches and nectarines and things. I used to apply in the fall 100 units and in the spring another 150 units or something like that. Twice a year, bam, that was it. Well, how much of that was being used, how much of it was maybe getting wasted? It's hard to say, but certainly spoon feeding a little at a time is more advantageous for the health of that plant. Yes, you still have to cut your nitrogen off at certain points if you want a slow growth to try to, mature your crop or whatever. There's ways you have to deal with that. But when you're spoon feeding, it's a lot easier to control that than it is if you're applying large amounts at one time. If you want to get your pump test, if you're in our program, we have money for testing the pump through PG&E. We also have money to help repair the pumps. Again, when my pump fell off last year, it affected my whole irrigation system performance. Everything was going wrong. Now, it was July. Where I'm at, the water levels are at about 80 feet now at my farm. It's pumping water levels while the pump is running. When I was a kid, they were about 40. Up until about 3 years ago, they were about 60. The last 3 years, they dropped another 20 feet. 20 feet in 30 or 40 years, 20 feet in the last 3 years. There's no recharge. There's all these things going on. It's going to exacerbate the problem. No surface water, or in many cases, lack of surface water deliveries. And so consequently, everybody's turning their deep wells on to keep farming. That's what we have to do. Got to keep in business. So if you're in a PG&E territory, you should get your pumps tested. If you're not in PG&E's territory, it's still a good idea. There's a list of pump testers back on the table back there along with the fact sheet from our program. If we can help you, you give us a call at Fresno State. We'll help you get your pump tested. Technical assistance and education, we do all that sort of thing too. Basically, a pump test is a measure of the wire-to-water efficiency on an electric pump. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you can see what a good OPE is on a pump on the second to last equation there, 67%. That'd actually be excellent. But usually, the thing that falls off are the bowls and impellers down here at the bottom. This is a vertical turbine pump. The bowls and impellers are what usually loses efficiency. The motor seldom loses much efficiency unless it's been rewound a bunch of times or it's got some other issue. But in the shafts and bearings, if you have good maintenance, it's not going to be a problem. But if water level changes, that changes the output of the design of those impellers. We do workshops, or I do them all the time on this sort of thing, about pumps and how they work. So you look at our diagram here, wire-to-water efficiency includes the motor, the transmissions, the shaft and bearing, and the bowls and impellers. This is the multiplying those together, it gives you the 67%. Down here is a poor OPE under 50%, which I said about a third of the pumps in California are that way. Nothing's fallen off in the motor and the transmission. The bowls and impellers are what have fallen off. So as water levels drop, it changes. Now, if you're pumping a little bit of sand, and almost every well in California has some have a lot, that also wears out impellers. Another thing can drop efficiency. So there's a couple different things that can occur with your pumps. When those fall off, it's going to affect your irrigation system. We also have a rebate now for smaller than 25 horsepower pumps. The other one we run is for 25 and up. PG&E has one for smaller than 25 also. So just keep that in mind. Well, if you have any questions, I'll be around during lunch. Thank you.
My name is Mike Johnson, and I am the guy who's responsible for doing all of the monitoring and reporting for the coalition. Okay, so there's three key points that I want you to take away from this next 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, the first is that our monitoring for you shows continued improvement in surface water quality. Back in 2008, I remember coming and talking to you and saying, boy, things aren't very good. Things have been actually very good in the last year or so. There are still a few problems that I'll discuss here in a minute, but in general, your water quality is quite good. There are additional reporting requirements that you have. There's the farm evaluations. I want to stress how important completing and returning those farm evaluations to us is. It's a very important part of your responsibilities for several reasons, and I'm going to touch on those here in a minute. Nutrient management plans, it's been talked about early on. Those are things that you're in the process of filling out now. They've been described earlier. Perry ran through that a bit. Those are not returned to the coalition. Those are kept on your operation. And then there'll be some information that you'll be required to turn in next year. And for us, what are the upcoming requirements over the next year? What are we working on now? So why do we monitor? This coalition, all of the coalitions in the valley, all of the, can't even keep track of how many there are now. Those coalitions all have permits, and that permit allows you to discharge to both surface water and groundwater. But that the rule is that if you discharge, somebody has to monitor. In this case, you have to monitor to demonstrate that you're in compliance with the requirements of your permit. Okay? So the requirements of the permit are that you can't discharge certain chemicals and certain things in excess of the amounts that the regional board allows. That's the bottom line. And we have to monitor to make sure that that's correct. So they set limits. Okay? And when we exceed those limits, that's what we call exceedances. There are concentrations of chemicals, certain concentrations of chemicals that the regional board allows in the water, both surface water and groundwater. There is no allowance for toxicity. The water that is discharged, the water that's found in the creeks and the sloughs and so on, cannot show any toxicity to any of the organisms that we use to test the water. As part of the monitoring, then, we have to determine the concentration of various chemicals. We have to determine the concentrations of a whole series of metals, a whole series of nutrients, ammonium, nitrate, and then bacteria as well. Also, pH, the acidity of the water, salinity of the water, and so on. Lots of monitoring. And again, we go ahead and we take the water, we send it off to the laboratory, and we determine the presence of toxicity. So here's the bottom line. The Stanislaus County results are here at the top. And so you can see that there's actually quite a bit of monitoring going on here in Stanislaus County. And part of that is because if you think about our coalition region, the coalition runs from Stanislaus County all the way down to Madera County. In Madera County, when I gave this talk a couple of weeks ago, there's not been any water to monitor. We have 4 sites in Madera County. There's water only part of the year in one of their sites. You guys have a lot more water, so we do a lot more monitoring. Okay, here's the results from last year. And our water year, this says from October 13 through September 14, the water year that we monitor runs now from October to September as opposed to a calendar year. And what you can see, the bottom line is here at the bottom. It says grand total. You can see a lot of big numbers here. And those big numbers are for a whole series of things that we don't worry about. Okay? Eventually, we may have to worry about them, but currently we don't. The regional board at this point in time has allowed us to ignore them. The other ones are here. These numbers here are our pesticide exceedance numbers. And you can see here, this is chlorpyrifos. Chlorpyrifos is the active ingredient in Lorsban. So we've had some problems with that in the past. If you look at over all of the years that we've been doing monitoring, if you were to look at the percentage of our problems due to Lorsban, it's probably about 80 to 90%. Okay? One chemical is about 80 to 90% of our problems. And then we have, this is molybdenum, which is found naturally in this region. It's a part of the groundwater, and when it's pulled up, it ends up in surface water. You can see here, there's nitrate. Nitrate is both a surface water problem and a groundwater problem. And we have some toxicity issues here as well. Okay, so what happens when you have those problems? Well, the first thing is that we have to determine whether we have 2 exceedances. In other words, we have more chemical in the water than is allowed by the regional board. If that happens twice within 3 years, we have to develop what's called a management plan. And that management plan then basically says what's our plan to solve the problem? And the regional board gives us 10 years to solve the problem. Actually, what they do is they say you have to solve the problem as soon as possible, not to exceed 10 years. So generally, we try to get these things solved in 3 or 4 or 5 years. So what happens when a management plan goes into effect? Well, first of all, we have to do a lot of additional monitoring. How else are we going to demonstrate that the problem's been solved? That additional monitoring costs money. And we must document that management practices are being implemented by you guys on your operations. That's the first reason why the farm evaluations are really important. They're our record of the management practices that you have on your operations. Those are the things that we can show the regional board to demonstrate, and I'll show you how we do that here in just a minute, to demonstrate that you're doing what needs to be done. Those are all of the locations where we currently have management plans for some problem, someplace or another. You can see there's actually quite a lot of them. I'll show you here in a minute though, this is actually much lower than it was in about 2008 and 9. And here's why. This is 2008 here on the left side, and these are, the blues are chlorpyrifos, and the kind of orange colors are copper, which have been 2 real problems for us over the course of the years. And you can see that over time, okay, that the percentage of samples with problems for both of those have gone way down. Okay. The other thing that's really important about this is that if you think of this as a percentage of the samples, 12%, 23%, we're down to 3% here last year. We used to collect 250 samples back in 2008. Today, we're collecting only about 100. So we're way down in the number of exceedances that we're experiencing, but there's still a few exceedances. Now, I said that things have gotten better, and so when we can demonstrate through monitoring and through the implementation, we show the regional board that you guys have implemented practices. When we do that, the regional board says, fine, your management plan is over, no more monitoring. And so over just the last 2 years, we've gotten rid of all of these different management plans for all of those different chemicals. Also bacteria here. E. coli is the bacteria. There's some toxicity that we've gotten rid of. So we've actually done quite a bit of sort of reduced monitoring. We haven't gotten rid of a lot of monitoring for you. Now, you may not think that looks like a lot, but that somewhere, at least in the vicinity of $50,000 a year. that you're not paying because water quality's been good. Okay? And the water quality's been good because you guys have done a good job in making sure that the water stays clean. A large part of the sort of demonstration to the regional board that things are going well is by showing that management practices have been implemented. And we do that now through the farm evaluations. The farm evaluation reports, you received one last year. We got those back. We recorded the information. If you should have received them for this year. If nothing has changed on your operation, you're just allowed to check the box, says everything's the same, and send them back in. If things have changed, please let us know what you're doing different. And if you haven't filled one out at all, please fill it out and return it to us, okay? First thing is that it's required by the regional board. They could, at any point in time, come to us and say, who has not submitted a farm evaluation? Which one of your members has not submitted a farm evaluation report? And we would be required to provide that information. They have not done that, and there's no indication that they're going to do that in the near future. But to make sure you cover yourself, please turn this in. And then, one of the things we've always told you all along, through these years, is that we never provide the regional board with any information about your operation individually. This is the way that we provide information to the regional board, okay? Figures like this, graphs like this. In fact, this graph comes right out of one of the reports that we submitted last summer. So as long as the regional board gets this kind of information, and as long as water quality stays good, they don't come knocking on anybody's door. So that's the important thing. Make sure that they don't come knocking on anybody's door. Okay, that was surface water. Groundwater. There was a groundwater assessment report. The purpose of that report was to identify areas of high vulnerability. I'm going to get into that a little bit more in a minute. There was a groundwater quality management plan because we know we have nitrate problems in the coalition region. So that was submitted actually just this last Monday to the regional board. And there's a trend monitoring work plan that's due in June. And once that's turned in and the regional board accepts that, we will start doing groundwater monitoring. And so next year, when we talk, there will be groundwater results to discuss. Currently, there's only surface water. Okay, so the key points about the groundwater assessment report. Again, I'm going to show you some maps here. I think Perry showed you some maps earlier. The high vulnerability are areas with shallow groundwater, high soil permeability, and low vulnerability are areas with deeper groundwater and heavier soils. I don't think that's a big surprise to anybody. But the other thing that the coalition had to do in their groundwater assessment report was to determine within those areas where there's lots of nitrate in groundwater, what are they going to prioritize for outreach? How are they going to, what are the regions, or how are they going to do with that? And so this coalition has decided, and I think it's a very good decision, to prioritize not based on sort of where you live, how close you live to a town, but based on what you grow. Okay? And the priorities are going to be the almonds, the walnuts, pistachios, corn, grapes, grains, because those make up the majority of the acres in that high vulnerability area. Not because they're particularly problematic, but just because they cover lots of acres. The groundwater quality management plan, one of the things that we are not doing is there is no attempt to try to link any concentration of nitrate in groundwater to anybody's operation on the surface, on the land surface. That's a fool's errand anyway, but that's something we've said we will never do. We have to provide outreach, and so some of the information that Perry's provided this morning is the outreach. He talked about wellhead protection and that sort of thing. And there is, in the future, there's the potential for smaller crop-specific meetings, but if it's decided that those are necessary, you'll be notified. We have to monitor both the practices that are implemented. Again, the farm evaluations are critical here, and the nutrient management plans, which you're filling out. Remember, you don't turn them in this year. You'll report some information next year. Those will be important as well, and then obviously just the actual groundwater monitoring. You can see that in Stanislaus County up here, most of the groundwater is contaminated. Most everybody here is in high vulnerability for groundwater, for nitrate contamination in groundwater. There's some greens, some purples, some sort of darker kind of grayish blue. These are the cities. You can see the greens are located around the cities. Those are the highest priorities because those are our public drinking water supplies. You can see the purple here, and then the sort of the blue out toward the outside, okay? So if you're in an area like this, and most of you probably are, then you will probably receive some information from Perry and the coalition about management practices. Okay, other requirements. Surface water quality management plan, we submitted it. It was tentatively approved. We have some changes. Again, a lot of what we do in that surface water quality management plans, we pull out of the farm evaluations. That's, again, it's critical to get that information into us. There's a sediment discharge and erosion assessment report. I'm going to show you some pictures here in a minute. And I think Perry talked about the management practices effectiveness program. Okay, nitrogen management plans. Perry's talked about this already. Erosion and sediment discharge. We had to determine if you lived on ground that was at risk for erosion and discharge of sediment into the waterways. The biggest fines for discharge that have been issued since the Irrigated Lands program started have been about sediment discharge, not about chemicals, not about bacteria, not about nitrate. It's been about sediment. And during the periods of high rainstorm, big rainstorms come through, Fish and Game goes out, flies that foothill area, and looks for sediment in the water. And when they find it, they trace it upstream, and those have been the biggest fines levied so far. We had to estimate where, if you lived on this ground, and you can see here the numbers are, we had to go through and estimate if you had the potential to discharge 5 tons of sediment per acre per year, you're in a high vulnerability area. And we mapped all those parcels. I'll show you the maps here in a minute. And if you live there, you operate there, you're going to have to fill out a sediment and erosion control plan. Those have not been approved yet, but when they are, you'll get them. They are not turned into the coalition. You just keep them on your operation. So, because the coalition region goes up to the crest of the Sierra, even though there's no farming up there, all of the brown here is high vulnerability. All that has the potential to discharge at least 5 tons per acre per year. Here's our coalition membership. These are all the parcels of the members. And here's the overlap. You can see that most of the overlap occurs up here in Stanislaus County, up in the foothill area. If you farm up here, you need to be careful because Fish and Game will be flying the area every time there's a rain, and you will probably have to fill out a sediment and erosion control plan shortly. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Perry. Like I said, I'll be here at lunchtime. I'll be floating around. If you have questions, feel free to grab me, and I'll be happy to answer what I can.